My name is Teresa Windley, and at 70 years old, the last thing I ever expected was to be laughed at by my own son at my husband's funeral. But there I was, standing in a house filled with memories, feeling a pain that was somehow sharper than the grief I was already carrying. Before I tell you how the smug, knowing look on his face was completely wiped away the very next day, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Go ahead and drop a comment below, and please hit that subscribe button because you are not going to believe the lengths my dear husband went to ensure the truth had the final word. The funeral service itself was just as Frank would have wanted it. Our old church in Charleston was filled to the brim, the air heavy with the sweet scent of magnolias and 50 years of shared history. I sat in the front pew, feeling the weight of every one of those years. My husband, Frank, was a good man, a strong man. His hands could take a rough piece of wood and turn it into something beautiful, something that would last. I thought the family he'd built was just as solid, but I was about to find out how wrong I was. I watched our son, Mark, sitting beside his wife, Brenda. From where I sat, I could see he wasn't crying. He looked serious. Yes, but it was the seriousness of a man weighing his new responsibilities, not the sorrow of a son who had just lost his father. Brenda, as always, looked perfect, her black dress tailored just so, her expression carefully composed. She kept whispering in his ear, and he would nod, a little frown on his face. They looked less like they were mourning and more like they were strategizing. Later, back at our home, the house was filled with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of plates. Every corner of that house held a memory of Frank. The grandfather clock in the hall, the rocking chair by the fire, the beautiful dining table, everyone was gathered around. He had made them all. I was standing by the fireplace, just trying to breathe, when I heard their voices float over from the dining room. It was Brenda who spoke first, her voice crisp and clear. The workshop assets are where we should start. Liquidate them. It's the fastest way to streamline the business and modernize. All that old equipment is just taking up space. My blood ran cold. The workshop was Frank's sanctuary. It was the soul of Windley and Sons. I walked over to them, my heart pounding in my chest. Several of our cousins and old family friends were standing nearby. "Your father would never sell the workshop," I said. My voice was quiet, but it was firm. The heart of the business is its craftsmanship. It always has been. Mark turned to look at me, and the expression on his face broke my heart all over again. It wasn't anger. It was pity. He gave a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a loud laugh, but in the quiet sadness of the room, it felt like a gunshot. "Mom, please," he said, his voice laced with a condescending sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Don't you worry your head about these things." He actually patted my arm. "Brenda and I are handling the business side of things now. It's all a bit complicated." Heads turned. I saw my niece look down at her shoes. Her face flushed with embarrassment for me. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me. And in that moment, I had never felt so small, so utterly erased. 50 years of partnership, of late-night discussions over the ledger books, of shared dreams built from sawdust and hard work, all of it dismissed with a pat on the arm and a laugh. I was no longer the other half of the whole. I was just a little old lady who shouldn't worry her pretty little head. The humiliation was a physical thing, a bitter taste at the back of my throat. I couldn't speak. I just stood there as Mark and Brenda moved away, already resuming their hushed conversation. I felt a gentle touch on my elbow and turned to see Arthur Davies, our family lawyer, and Frank's oldest friend. His kind eyes, watery with his own grief, looked directly into mine. "The reading of the will is tomorrow at 10. Teresa," he said softly, his voice for me alone. "I believe you'll want to be there." There was something in the way he said it, a weight, a meaning that I couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't just a simple reminder. It was a promise of something. And as I looked at his kind, earnest face, a tiny, fragile flicker of something I hadn't felt all day sparked within me. It wasn't quite hope, but it was enough to make me nod and decide that no matter how much it hurt, I would be there. I had to be. As I walked away from Arthur, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life, that one look from him was the only thing I had to hold on to, a tiny flicker of hope in a sea of humiliation. He clearly knew something I didn't. What do you think my husband had planned? Let me know your predictions in the comments below. And you'll want to make sure you're subscribed, because what happens in that office is something no one in my family, especially my son, ever saw coming. After the last car pulled away, the silence in the house was deafening. It was a heavy, unfamiliar quiet, a quiet without Frank's steady presence in it. I walked through the rooms, my hand trailing along the smooth, polished wood of a bookshelf he'd made. Every object held his echo. It was in this profound stillness that the memories started to rush in, not as ghosts, but as pieces of a story that I suddenly needed to remember. My mind drifted back, almost 51 years, to a little craft fair in Marion Square. I was just out of college with a degree in accounting, something not a lot of young women were doing back then. I saw him before I saw his work. Frank Windley. He was standing behind a table of the most beautiful hand-carved boxes, looking completely lost. He had sawdust in his hair and a shy smile, and he was practically giving his work away. I bought a small cherrywood box that day. "This is exquisite," I told him. "You should be charging 3 times this much." He just blushed and shuffled his feet. "I'm no good with the numbers part," he admitted. "I just like making things." And that's how it started. I was good with the numbers part. I saw the genius in his hands, but I also saw that without a plan, his talent would just be a hobby. We started talking, first over coffee, then over dinner. I'd listen for hours as he talked about the grain of the wood, the feel of a perfect joint, and he'd listen, his eyes wide with a kind of baffled wonder as I talked about profit margins, overhead costs, and business projections. We were 2 halves of a whole, and we both knew it even back then. When we decided to get married and start a proper business, it was me who sat at our little kitchen table for weeks, drafting the business plan. It was me who took my small savings and my accounting degree and walked into the Charleston Bank and Trust. I remember the bank manager, a stern man named Mr. Abernathy, looking at my figures over the top of his spectacles. Frank was a bundle of nerves beside me, but I was calm. I believed in his work, and I believed in my numbers. We walked out of there with our first business loan. It was my idea to call it Windley and Sons. Frank wanted to call it Windley's Woodcraft, or something simple like that. "No," I told him, looking him straight in the eye. "This is going to be a legacy, something for a family we haven't even started yet." He loved that. He loved the forward-thinking hope in it. But for me, the most important word in that name was the one we didn't say. It was the ampersand, the little and that I imagined between Windley and Sons. That silent and stood for me. I was the connection, the partner that joined the name to the future. For the first 20 years, I was the one who managed the books. I handled the payroll, the taxes, the suppliers. Frank ran the workshop, managing the craftsmen, and ensuring every piece that left our doors was perfect. Our partnership was a well-oiled machine. He was the artist, and I was the architect who built the structure around his art so it could flourish. Then Mark was born, and in those days, a choice had to be made. I looked at my baby boy, and I looked at the ledger books, and I knew I couldn't give my all to both. I chose my son. I never regretted it for a moment. But stepping back from the day-to-day operations didn't mean I stepped away from the business. It just meant our partnership became even more private. Frank became the public face of Winley and Sons. He was the one who went to the business meetings, who accepted the awards. But every single night, after Mark was tucked into bed, Frank would walk into the kitchen, pour 2 cups of coffee, and spread the day's paperwork out on the table. "All right, Tess," he'd say, "talk to me." We went over every major decision, every big order, every new hire. I was his sounding board, his strategist, his most trusted advisor. He never made a significant move without asking me first. It was our secret, a quiet understanding that was the bedrock of our lives. Sitting there in the lonely dark of my living room, the sting of Mark's laughter came back to me. The condescending way he told me not to worry my head. He had no idea. He was looking at his mother and seeing only a sweet old lady, a grieving widow who had spent her life baking cookies and arranging flowers. He didn't see the woman who secured the loan that built his inheritance, the woman who named the company that he was now so eager to control. The humiliation wasn't just that he'd been unkind. It was that he had erased my entire life's work with a single, thoughtless laugh. And he didn't even know he'd done it. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the old house sounded like a footstep, like Frank was about to walk down the hall. When morning finally came, I felt tired down to my bones. The smell of fresh coffee pulled me downstairs, but the scene in my kitchen stopped me in my tracks. Mark and Brenda were sitting at the kitchen table, the one Frank had built for me as a wedding present. They had laptops open, papers spread out between them. It looked like they had moved their entire office into my home overnight. They were talking in low, serious tones, and they didn't even look up when I walked in. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. I was an intruder in my own kitchen. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hands trembling just slightly. "Good morning," I said, my voice sounding strange and thin. Brenda looked up, a bright, artificial smile plastered on her face. "Teresa, good. We were just talking about you." Her tone made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Oh," I said, taking a sip of coffee. "Yes," she continued, folding her hands neatly on top of a stack of papers. "Mark and I were just discussing what your next steps should be. This is an awfully big house for one person. All the upkeep, the stairs, we worry." I looked at Mark, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. He just kept typing on his laptop. "We found a lovely, secure retirement community just a town over," Brenda went on, her voice full of false concern. "It's brand new. It has a dining hall, planned activities, other people your age. It would be so much easier for you." I stared at her, the coffee cup frozen halfway to my lips. My house. The home where I had raised my son, the home I had shared with my husband for half a century. The walls held our laughter, our arguments, the pencil marks on the doorframe measuring Mark's height as a boy. And she was talking about it as if it were a worn-out piece of furniture to be discarded. "This is my home, Brenda," I said, setting the cup down with a soft click. "I have no intention of leaving." Brenda's smile tightened. "Well, we can discuss it later. It's just something to think about." I knew I needed to change the subject, to get my feet back on solid ground. I decided to talk about the one thing, besides Frank, that I knew better than anyone. "Mark," I said, turning to my son, "what about the contract with the Vanderbilt family? Their order for the library paneling is supposed to be ready next month. Mrs. Vanderbilt is very particular. They've been our clients since the beginning." Mark finally stopped typing and looked at me. He gave me that same pitying smile from the day before. And then he reached across the table and patted my hand as if I were a frightened child. "It's all taken care of, Mom," he said, his voice soft and patronizing. "We have accountants and project managers for all of that now. You don't need to trouble yourself with the details anymore." And there it was again, the dismissal, the quiet, soul-crushing wave of his hand that pushed me away from my own life. He didn't just dismiss my question. He dismissed 50 years of knowledge, of carefully cultivated relationships with clients who had become friends. He dismissed me. I pulled my hand back from under his. I didn't say another word. I just stood there, watching them. They went right back to their conversation, their voices a low murmur of business terms and financial plans. It was in that moment that I truly felt like a ghost in my own house. I was there, but they couldn't see me. They saw a problem to be solved, a set of logistics to be managed. They saw an old woman who needed to be put somewhere safe, somewhere easy, somewhere out of their way. They had already divided up my life, my home, my future, and they hadn't even bothered to ask me. The reading of the will wasn't just about Frank's wishes anymore. It felt like it was going to be the final word on my own existence. I went upstairs to my bedroom to get ready, the echoes of their conversation following me. Brenda's talk of a lovely retirement community, Mark's condescending pat on my hand. It all swirled in my head, making me feel weary and powerless. I opened my closet to pick out a simple dress, and my eyes fell on a framed photograph on my dresser. It was of Frank and me taken on our 40th anniversary. He had his arm around me, and we were both laughing. Looking at his face, his kind eyes, my mind drifted away from the coldness in the kitchen and back to the quiet, difficult months of his final year. It wasn't just the illness that had changed him. Of course, he had grown frail, his strong hands less steady than they once were. But there was another change, something deeper. He had become more thoughtful, more reflective. He would spend hours just sitting in his favorite armchair, not reading or watching television, just looking out the window or sometimes just looking at me. He had a look on his face that I couldn't quite decipher, a mix of love and a deep, settled sadness that seemed to be about more than just his own failing health. I thought at the time that he was simply coming to terms with the end of his life, making his peace with the world. I see now that it was more complicated than that. I remember one evening in late autumn, we were sitting on the screened-in porch, watching the sun set behind the live oak trees. He hadn't spoken for a while, and then, out of the blue, he said, "Tess, I was a fool." I looked over at him. "What are you talking about, Frank?" "I was a fool not to put your name on the door from the start," he said, his voice raspy but clear. "The world should have known this was yours as much as mine. Windley and Windley. That's what it should have been." I reached over and took his hand. It felt thin in mine. "Hush now," I said softly. "It doesn't matter. It never mattered to me." And it hadn't. I had made my choice, and I had been happy with our private partnership. But he just shook his head slowly, a profound regret in his eyes. Then there were the long afternoons he spent with Arthur Davies. Arthur started visiting the house more often in those last 6 months. I would bring them both a tray of coffee and some biscuits in Frank's study, and then leave them to it. I'd close the door behind me and hear the low murmur of their voices, talking about things I assumed were related to estate taxes and legal jargon. I figured Frank was just being his usual meticulous self, making sure everything was neat and tidy, so I wouldn't have to deal with a mess after he was gone. It never once occurred to me that they were doing anything more than just standard end-of-life planning. The memory that came back to me most clearly, though, happened just a few weeks before he passed. He was weak, confined to his bed most of the day. I was sitting beside him, reading the newspaper aloud, when he reached out and took my hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. He turned his head on the pillow to look at me, and his eyes were burning with an intensity that startled me. "Listen to me, Tess," he said, his voice urgent. "I'm going to make sure they know. I'm going to make it right." I thought I knew exactly what he meant. "Oh, Frank," I whispered, my eyes filling with tears. Everything is right between us. It always has been. I truly believed he was talking about us, about our life, about making his peace with God. I thought he was telling me he was ready for the hereafter, and that he wanted me to know his conscience was clear. The idea that he meant something legal, something tangible that would affect Mark and Brenda, and the will never even entered my mind. As I stood there in my quiet bedroom, fastening a simple pearl necklace around my neck, these memories fit together like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was supposed to solve. Arthur's meaningful look at the funeral, Frank's regret, his intense final promise. I still didn't know what it all meant. I certainly didn't feel confident or powerful, but I no longer felt completely invisible. I felt like my husband had left me a message, and I was about to finally hear it. With a deep breath, I walked out of the room and down the stairs to face whatever was waiting for me. The drive to Arthur Davies's office was quiet. Mark and Brenda sat in the front of their big new sedan, and I sat in the back. I had my husband's promise to make it right echoing in my ears, but I truly had no idea what that meant. When we walked into that mahogany-paneled office, my son and his wife looked so confident, so sure of themselves, and I felt like I was walking into the lion's den. If you've ever had to face a difficult family situation like that, one where you felt completely alone, hit that like button right now to show a little support. Honestly, it means a lot. All right, let's see what happened next. Arthur's office was exactly as I remembered it from all the times I'd accompanied Frank over the years. It was filled with dark mahogany furniture that Frank himself had built decades ago, and the air smelled of old paper and leather. It was a room that felt solid and permanent. Mark and Brenda sat on one side of Arthur's large desk, looking completely at home. Mark leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the back, the picture of a man about to inherit his kingdom. Brenda sat beside him, a leather-bound planner open in front of her, her pen poised. She looked like she was about to take notes at a board meeting. They were a team, a well-oiled machine ready to take over. I sat on the other side, alone, my handbag resting primly in my lap. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. Whatever was about to happen would happen. I had survived the last 2 days. I would survive this. Arthur came in, looking solemn in his dark suit. He nodded at each of us before sitting behind his desk. He put on his reading glasses and picked up the document in front of him. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice formal. "We are here today to read the last will and testament of Franklin James Windley." He started with the usual legal language, the dry, formal phrases that begin every will. He confirmed Frank's identity, declared him to be of sound mind, and listed the standard bequests to a few long-serving employees and a small donation to the local historical society. Mark and Brenda listened with polite impatience, their expressions making it clear this was just the preamble. Then Arthur paused. He took off his glasses and looked at us over the top of the papers. The room suddenly felt very still. "Before I proceed to the primary bequests," he said, his gaze lingering on me for just a fraction of a second, "I need to inform you that Frank included a personal letter. He gave me explicit instructions that this letter be read aloud in its entirety as an official addendum to the will itself." I saw a flicker of something in Brenda's eyes. Annoyance, perhaps. Mark just shifted in his chair, crossing his legs. He probably thought it was going to be some sentimental speech about family values. Arthur put his glasses back on and cleared his throat. He picked up a separate, sealed envelope, opened it carefully, and began to read. The words he spoke were Frank's. I could hear my husband's voice in every syllable. "To my family," the letter began. "If you are hearing this, it means I am gone. I have had a good life, a full life, made richer than I ever deserved by my wife, Teresa, It is primarily about her and about the history of our business that I must speak now to set a record straight that has been crooked for far too long. My hands tightened on my purse. Across the desk, Mark sat up a little straighter. Arthur continued reading, his voice steady. When Teresa and I started this journey, I was a craftsman with a bit of talent and no common sense. She was the one with the vision. She was the one who saw a future where I only saw a hobby. She created the business plan that secured our first loan. She managed our finances with a skill I could never master. For 20 years, she was the silent engine that made everything run, sacrificing her own ambitions to build our foundation. Brenda's pen was no longer poised over her planner. It was held stiffly in her hand, forgotten. My son, Frank's letter went on, and I could feel the love and regret in those words. I taught you how to work wood. I taught you to respect the grain, to value a perfect joint. I failed, however, to teach you where the true strength of this company came from. It did not come from the workshop. It came from the kitchen table, where your mother pored over the ledgers late into the night. It came from her brilliant mind. I allowed the world, and you, to believe this company was my creation alone. That was the biggest mistake of my life, a sin of omission that I am now here to correct. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, and I didn't bother to wipe it away. Therefore, Arthur read, his voice gaining a new weight, I have structured my will to reflect this truth. Firstly, our home on Trad Street and all personal assets, including my savings and investments, are left unconditionally to my beloved wife, Teresa. Brenda let out a small, almost inaudible gasp. As for the business, Windley and Sons, Arthur continued, because it was hers from the beginning, I hereby return what is rightfully hers. The silence in the room was absolute. To my son, Mark Windley, I leave 49% of the company shares. I name him president of Windley and Sons, a position he is more than capable of fulfilling. However, his inheritance of these shares is contingent upon his acceptance of this role, reporting directly to the new CEO. Arthur paused, taking a deliberate breath before delivering the final blow. The remaining 51% of company shares, the controlling interest, along with the title of Chief Executive Officer, I leave to my wife, my partner, and the true founder of this company, Teresa Windley. Can you just imagine the silence in that room? The shock on their faces? 51%. Frank had not only set the record straight, he had handed me back the keys to my own life. That single sentence changed everything. Before I tell you exactly how my son reacted, I have to pause and ask you, if you were in that room and heard those words, what would your immediate, honest-to-goodness reaction be? Drop a comment below right now. I want to read them all and feel this moment of vindication with you. The explosion was immediate. This is insane. Mark shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. His face was a dark, mottled red. He was old. He was confused. She manipulated him. This is her doing. Brenda just sat there, her mouth slightly ajar, her carefully constructed composure shattered. I didn't flinch. I just looked at my son, at his rage and his disbelief, and I felt a deep, profound sadness for him. Arthur Davies remained perfectly calm. He let Mark's accusations hang in the air for a moment before he slowly, deliberately reached down beside his chair. He lifted a thick, dusty folder and placed it on the polished surface of the desk with a soft thud. Frank anticipated this reaction. Mark, Arthur said, his voice calm but hard as iron. He pushed the folder across the desk towards my son. This file contains the original company ledgers from the first 20 years, all in your mother's handwriting. It also contains the initial loan applications from the Charleston Bank and Trust, with her signature as the financial guarantor. He wasn't finished. Furthermore, he said, his eyes locking with Mark's, it contains a notarized statement signed by your father less than 2 months ago and verified by 2 separate physicians, Dr. Allen and Dr. Roth, confirming his sound state of mind and his clear intentions regarding these arrangements. Any attempt to contest this would not only fail, it would make all of this documentation a matter of public record. Mark stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. He opened his mouth to say something else, but no words came out. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a pale, stunned silence. He knew he was beaten. My husband, my quiet, gentle Frank, had thought of everything. He had made his promise right. Mark stood there for a long moment, his chest rising and falling, his face a pale mask of shock and fury. He looked from the folder on the desk to my face, and for a second, I saw the little boy I used to tuck into bed. But it was gone in a flash, replaced by a cold, hard resentment. He didn't say another word. He snatched his coat from the back of the chair, grabbed Brenda's arm, and stormed out of the office. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, and the sound echoed in the sudden, ringing silence. I just sat there, my hands still clasped around my handbag. The room felt enormous. I could hear the ticking of the grand old clock in the corner, a sound I hadn't noticed before. It was the sound of time moving forward again. Arthur Davies slowly took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked tired, but he also looked relieved. He looked over at me, his expression full of a deep and gentle compassion. "He loved you very much, Teresa," Arthur said softly. "I hope you know that." I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. "These last few months," he continued, leaning forward on his elbows, "he talked about you all the time. He was so proud of you, proud of your mind, proud of your strength. He just didn't know how to fix what he had allowed to happen until the very end. He felt he had let your story get buried, and it was a weight on him, a heavy weight." Arthur reached down and lifted the thick, dusty folder he had placed on the desk. He didn't slide it towards me. He stood up, walked around the desk, and placed it gently in my hands. "He wanted you to have this," he said, "the originals, your story in your own hand." I looked down at the folder. It was warm from his touch. It felt impossibly heavy. The drive home was a blur. I don't remember much of the traffic or the streets. I just remember sitting in the back of Arthur's car. He had insisted on driving me with the folder sitting on my lap like a sleeping child. The world outside the window looked exactly the same, but my place in it had been fundamentally changed. When I stepped back into my house, the silence was different. It was no longer the heavy, lonely silence of grief. It was a peaceful quiet. It was the quiet of a place that was truly my own. I walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table where my son had dismissed me so easily just that morning. I placed the folder in front of me and just looked at it for a long time. Finally, with trembling hands, I untied the faded ribbon holding it together and opened it. The smell of old paper, dry and sweet, filled the air. On top lay a thick, leather-bound ledger. The cover was worn, the corners soft with age. I opened it to the first page. The date at the top of the page was April 1st, 1975, and the neat, precise columns of numbers were written in a clear, confident script that I recognized as my own. My fingers traced the lines of ink. Materials cost, labor, overhead, profit. It was all there. A detailed accounting of the first year we were in business. I turned the page, and then another and another. Years of my life were captured in these numbers. The lean years where the profit column was frighteningly small. The good years when a big contract meant we could finally afford a new piece of equipment. I saw the account for the Vanderbilt family, the one I had asked Mark about. It was there, spanning decades, a testament to a relationship I had helped build and nurture. I closed my eyes, my hand resting on the open page. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel a surge of victory over Mark or Brenda. What I felt was a profound and sorrowful weight. It was the weight of 50 years of silence, the weight of a truth that had finally been spoken, but so very late. It was the weight of my own story, which I was holding in my hands for the first time. Tears began to stream down my face, hot and silent. They weren't tears of sadness for Frank or tears of anger at my son. They were for the young woman who had written in this book, the sharp, ambitious woman who had believed in her husband's talent and her own mind. They were tears of gratitude that she had not been forgotten. It was the quiet, aching, and deeply satisfying feeling of vindication. A week passed. It was the quietest week of my life. I spent most of it in Frank's old study, not grieving, but studying. I went through the ledgers I had once written, but I also went through the reports from the last 10 years, the ones Mark had overseen. I read every client file, every supplier contract, every financial statement. I was not just reminiscing about the past. I was arming myself for the future. The tears had dried, and in their place, a quiet, steely resolve had formed. On Monday morning, 1 week to the day after the will was read, I got up, showered, and put on a navy blue suit I hadn't worn in years. I was ready. When I walked through the front doors of the Windley & Sons main office, the receptionist's jaw nearly hit the floor. She had only ever seen me at the annual Christmas party, a quiet wife on her husband's arm. Today, she saw something else entirely. As I walked past the desks, the usual morning chatter died down. People stopped typing and looked up, their faces a mixture of curiosity and confusion. They were expecting to see a fragile, grieving widow. I made sure they saw a composed woman with a purpose. I didn't stop or hesitate. I walked directly to the senior office manager's desk. "Good morning, Cynthia," I said calmly. "Please assemble the senior staff in the conference room in 5 minutes. That includes the workshop foreman." 5 minutes later, I walked into the conference room. The long table, a magnificent piece of mahogany Frank had built with his own hands, was surrounded by the 5 key people who ran the company: the head of sales, the accountant, the workshop foreman, Cynthia, and my son. Mark was sitting at the far end of the table, his arms crossed, a sullen, stormy look on his face. He looked like a teenager who had been called to the principal's office. I walked to the head of the table, to the chair that had always been Frank's, and sat down. I placed my notebook and a pen on the polished surface in front of me. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." I began, my voice even and steady. I looked around the table, making eye contact with each person before my gaze finally settled on Mark, who refused to look at me. I didn't mention the will. I didn't mention Frank's passing. I didn't mention anything personal at all. I have spent the last week reviewing the company's current operations and Q4 projections, I said, opening my notebook. I want to start by addressing the proposed switch of our primary lumber supplier to the overseas vendor, Global Timber. The accountant shifted uncomfortably. I knew this had been Mark's big idea, his first major move as the presumed heir. "On paper," I continued, "their rates are 10% lower, which seems attractive. However, I've done my research. Global Timber has an average shipment delay rate of 15%. Our contracts, particularly with our high-end custom clients, have penalty clauses for delays that would wipe out any savings. Furthermore, their North American red oak is not kiln-dried to the same standard that Frank insisted upon for 60 years. It's a shortcut that will lead to warping and cracking, and we'll be dealing with customer complaints and brand damage within 5 years." I paused, letting that sink in. The workshop foreman, a man who had worked with Frank for 30 years, was nodding slowly, a look of dawning respect on his face. Effective immediately, we are canceling that proposal. I stated, I've already reached out to our traditional supplier in North Carolina and have renegotiated our bulk rate. They've given us a 7% discount based on our long history. We will prioritize quality over false economy. That has always been the Windley way. For the next 20 minutes, I went through my notes, item by item. I discussed client retention strategies, production schedules, and a new marketing idea I had. I spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the business not just from reports, but from its very bones. The room was silent, the staff stunned into stillness. They were realizing that I was not just Frank Windley's widow. Finally, I closed my notebook. I folded my hands on the table and looked directly at my son. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the family drama they had all been expecting. "Mark," I said, my voice softer now, but no less firm. "Your father believed you had the potential to lead this company one day. So do I." His head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. This was not the attack he had been steeling himself for. He also knew that leadership has to be earned. I continued calmly. It requires a deep understanding of every part of this business, especially the parts that don't show up on a spreadsheet. It requires humility and a respect for the legacy you've been given. The choice is yours whether you wish to learn. I will expect your decision by the end of the week. I stood up. "Thank you for your time," I said to the room. And without another glance at my son, I turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving them all to process the undeniable fact that there was a new CEO at Windley and Sons. It's been 6 months since I walked into that conference room. The seasons have changed, and so has the world inside the walls of Windley and Sons. The business is thriving. It turns out that a blend of old-fashioned quality and some new ideas was exactly what the company needed. Our employees seem happier. Our clients are thrilled with the work. And for the first time in a long time, the future feels bright and solid. 2 months ago, I established the Franklin Windley Grant for Women in the Trades. It's a scholarship to help young women who want to become carpenters, electricians, or plumbers, to build things with their own hands, just like Frank did. It's my way of honoring his legacy while also ensuring that other women have the support to have their names on the door from the very beginning. You're probably wondering about Mark. He showed up at my office at the end of that first week. He looked tired and humbled, and he simply said, "I'd like to learn." Our relationship isn't what it once was. The easy affection between a mother and son has been replaced by something more formal, more careful. It's difficult sometimes, but for the first time, it's based on an honest truth. He sees me now, not just as his mother, but as the woman who built the company he works for. He is learning the business from the ground up, and I believe, in time, he will be a fine leader. Brenda, it turned out, was not interested in being married to a company president who answered to his mother. She was gone by the end of the month. Sometimes I sit in Frank's old study, my study now, and I think about that week. The pain, the humiliation, the anger. Some might call what happened revenge. But in my heart, I know it wasn't that. Revenge is about causing pain, and that was never my intention. My son's pain was a consequence of the truth, not the goal of it. What I did was about honoring my husband's final, desperate wish to make things right. It was about reclaiming the story of my own life. For 50 years, I was the silent partner, the invisible, and in Windley and Sons, I was happy in the shadows because I was happy with my life, with my husband and my son. I never asked for the spotlight, but when my contribution was not just ignored, but actively erased and laughed at, I knew I couldn't remain silent any longer. Standing up for myself wasn't about payback. It was about picking up the pen and writing the final chapter of my own story in my own words. So many women of a certain generation have their own stories of being the silent partner, of building things that others put their names on. Have you, or someone you know, ever felt your contributions were overlooked by your own family? What does it truly mean to find your voice again later in life? Please share your wisdom and your stories in the comments below. I believe we can all learn from each other. If this story resonated with you, please do me a favor and give it a thumbs up and share it with a friend who might need to hear it. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about family, truth, and finding your own strength when you least expect it. Thank you for joining me on this journey.